I will also speak in English because my French often comes out as Mandarin these days. I live in Singapore, so I want to speak a bunch about my Tao Center report, which actually just got published in early October. But I've been thinking a lot about what's changed over the last few weeks and months. And largely, it's really focusing on the changes of how coverage is affected by technology, but also more about how we cover technology as a subject. So obviously the rest of the conversation today has largely been about the effect of technology on journalism, but really I want to focus on how journalism covers the topic of technology. So I have been thinking a lot about what happens now, as many of my friends and colleagues have been as well. And in the process of processing the shock, I asked myself the question, am I doing the right thing with my life? What's the most important contribution that I could be putting forth in the world to address this moment? And I thought to myself, well, writing technology criticism, how could this have any bearing on the kind of political climate and the social climate? But then I thought through the rest of what comes out in this post-mortem moment after the election, and it turns out that most of the issues that we're talking about have some bearing on technology, or technology is a core part of what we're talking about. So, for example, we've been talking about how the narrative has been fractured across audiences and how we've kind of found ourselves in filter bubbles outside of, not seeing much outside of our affinity groups. We've talked a lot about how false news has spread in this moment and was arguably made possible by platforms like Facebook and the attention economies involved in those platforms. We can also talk about how the libertarian seasteading tech investor and Silicon Valley influencer Peter Thiel donated $1.25 million to Trump's campaign, and the following backlash within the tech industry of his choice. We can also talk about how VCs and Silicon Valley leaders in the moments during the election results pouring in started tweeting about dabbling in the idea of secession and a Cal exit as a reaction to this moment, and what that means for them to make that kind of statement. And even just the concept of the talking about Hillary's emails, that became a kind of stain on the campaign, just the word email, when really that story was largely about proper IT provisioning by the government, devices, choice in devices, and user preferences. So it's clear that more than ever, technology is implicated as a tool of power and social and in social and political life. And importantly, I think we need better ways of understanding what our relationship to technology as a society is. And in doing that, I think the argument can be made that more critical approaches to understanding technology and our relationship to it are needed. So that's the thrust behind this Tao research that I've been conducting over the last previous year, largely looking at how we cover technology today and the range of ways that we do it. And when I'm talking about technology, I largely mean consumer technology, but that also covers things like infrastructure behind the scenes. But it's also not just gadgets, it's also the processes and practices surrounding those technologies. And over the course of looking at kind of where we started maybe 10 to 15 years ago in how technology was talked about and written about to today, it's becoming more clear that technology is a part of everything. So it's this necessarily intersectional thing between politics and business and structures and economics and even things like topics like labor and urbanism. So what was becoming clear in talking to a lot of journalists and writers and even bloggers about the way that their approach to writing about technology has changed over time is that it has largely shifted from just being about coverage and has become increasingly critical over time. It's not just about looking at what Google announced the day before. So what I want to kind of push is the idea that there is a certain kind of spectrum between journalism and criticism, and that it's not necessarily a binary as it kind of looks here, but rather that it's a spectrum of criticality and contextualization, the work of interpretation, meaning making. So not just asking questions about what is happening or how it's happening, but getting to the core of why it's happening and why that might mean something. So when I asked a lot of journalists and writers about their associations with technology critics and technology criticism, what largely became clear was that people had a very negative association with the term tech critic. To be fair, that's a largely US-focused sample, New York media-focused. So that association may be a little different here, as there obviously seems to be slightly more of an appetite for criticism in Europe. But the thing that kept coming up was associations with tech critics being like Cassandras or Luddites smashing looms, or even just the kind of concept of the contrarian being against something and looking for the fault, finding the fault in something, in reviewing it. And I think that largely has to do with the tactics of the prominent critics of technology that we have today. So what I tried to do was to outline the ways that they talk about technology and their practices and of style and approaches to writing about these things, to try to classify what's uniquely problematic about the way that it's been done so far. So one example is the idea of preaching to the choir. So certain technology critics have largely been approaching an audience of intellectuals who are arguably already predisposed to hate Silicon Valley and its ilk. Or you also have a set of an often body of work that is largely tearing down the problem and describing it, but not necessarily offering any alternative or other way of living, or alternative kind of context outside of the technocratic libertarian vision. And most importantly, there's kind of a chance that the writers that we're looking to kind of exhibit the problematic underlying ideology that they're not even aware that they're kind of putting forth, which is, for example, using kind of buzzwords of moral panics to try to get people's attention. And that's largely because of the attention economy that these articles have to live in, of course. But using words like, oh, our current issue is technology is making us stupid, or giving us hyperactivity disorder as a result of this kind of technological environment. So most of these critics, this list of critics that I saw in the research was actually quite small. They included Nicholas Carr, Sherry Turkle, Evgeny Morozov. There were a couple more names, but these writers kept coming up. And what's problematic about this is that these tech critics are often the ones we go to write the response piece or the alternative side of the story. And what matters is that these people end up taking a lot of space. So in the same weekend, there was an op-ed and written by Sherry Turkle, basically promoting her book, and a sympathetic review of the book from Jonathan Franzen, who is a known kind of anti-technology curmudgeon. And so having all this in one place, even just within the pages of the New York Times, really puts a lot of attention on one voice and one way of thinking about the problem. Henry Farrell, looking at the attention economics that drives those problematic practices, tried to illustrate that these tech critics go alongside with a group of tech intellectuals, as he called them, some academics who straddle the industry and kind of gain consulting fees from their speeches and things like that. But not included in his list were women or primarily writers and journalists, importantly. So I was trying to look at this and say, okay, there's still a much broader range of people who are contributing to the conversation. And who are those people, and where are they publishing? So this will be illegible here, but I promise it's in the report where you can actually read it. And that would be at the bit.ly link on all the slides. But the idea here was to look at a much broader spectrum of people who would not necessarily associate themselves with criticism or call themselves a critic, but who are contributing, in my opinion and in this kind of analysis, to a broader conversation about technology and society. And those people included journalists, bloggers, academics, writers, technologists and entrepreneurs. And what is important in this kind of network diagram, that is kind of a rudimentary network diagram, albeit, is that there's a lot of overlap of roles and kind of titles that people share. And a lot of that has to do with the idea of a bridge figure, kind of using the translational role of speaking one language, whether that's the kind of tech entrepreneur side of things, and crossing a boundary into addressing the kind of policy side or the critical side of the conversation. Looking at that set of people, I wanted to highlight and illustrate the variety of ways that they were tackling more targeted and interesting questions about technology and society. So asking questions about how the design and development of structures shape technology and its uses, or talking about how marginalized people are represented in the design and development of technologies, or the relationship to power structures as technologies kind of put them out in the world. So lastly, my main argument behind all of this work leads me to something that is not only talking about widening the scope of who we consider in the critical discourse about technology, but rather arguing for a different kind of technology criticism, and that is constructive technology criticism. So besides doing the work of deconstructing and naming and interpreting these kind of technological phenomena around us, criticism has the potential to assemble new insights and interpretations. And I just want to illustrate how constructive technology criticism can work in the world through this kind of common theme we've been talking about all day today, Facebook and the elections and fake news. Primarily, this kind of gets messy because it's both about Facebook as a technology and Facebook as in its role in media, of course. And so, but that fundamentally is the crux of why this, why careful writing about criticism and considered writing about technology is important at this moment. So technology criticism, I think, in a constructive sense, can pose the alternatives, looking at alternative futures, alternative solutions. So in this case, in addressing the Facebook fake news problem, a group of students just got together over, I think it was 36 hours, and developed a verification plugin in a hackathon to tag stories as false or not. Similarly, Eli Pariser, who is the author of The Filter Bubble, put it out on Twitter to ask people to collaborate on concrete solutions to Facebook's problem. And importantly, I think this does something interesting, which is not to just point at the problem, but to bring a whole bunch of people together, and whether that's technologists or users or policymakers, this was an open Google Doc just for anyone to contribute. So in my mind, tech criticism and constructive technology criticism has an ability to bring about impacts and results, and has influence on the way that we use technology and the way that technology changes over time. So in this case, Zuckerberg went from saying that the argument that fake news on Facebook affected the election was a pretty crazy idea, to enlisting some concrete things that his team was looking at and had in the works, in detail, of course, on Facebook. But he didn't kind of put it out there until he was held accountable. Technology criticism also, importantly, does the work of kind of holding a fire under those solutions, right? So in this example, Facebook, it became clear, I think it was a New York Times article, that looked at Facebook's existing feature development, talking about China's possibilities of doing filtering and verification in China as a way to get into that market. It's been clear that it would be a third-party software or a third-party partner to monitor the rising popular stories and filter for geographic reasons. But the fact that this already exists kind of only came to light because people were looking very closely at what those solutions were. Lastly, I think technology criticism has the potential to help users and readers in a very concrete way. In this moment, I think a lot of people are wondering, like, how am I supposed to address this filter bubble problem? I cannot personally control my Facebook feed. Or what do I do about false news in my Facebook world, my personalized experience? And I think what technology criticism can do is provide something that's really concrete and grounded and realistic, and acknowledging the kind of lived experience of technology on the ground, and giving us tools to actually do something concrete. And in this case, literally being able to report as a user and contribute to the solution. So I want to pose this as a kind of provocation to the budding journalists, especially in the room. I think there's still a lot of question in my mind about where constructive technology criticism and that kind of writing can live, where it can get published, who gets to write it, and where that kind of more prescriptive work can live, especially as we're talking about the line between editorializing and reporting. And of course, the biggest challenge of all of this is, when your access to your audience as a publisher is mediated through Facebook in instant articles or in the feed, what publications can actually afford to continue to publish criticism of Facebook in this accountability kind of framework when literal access to your audience is on the line? So I think that's still a very open question. My concrete contribution to all of this is the white paper, the actual report of all this research, available on the Columbia Journalism School's Columbia Journalism Review's website. But I also have provided something a little bit concrete for the kind of more intellectually or academically interested folks, including journalism students, is in the form of an annotated syllabus. And the idea behind that is to pair concrete examples of writing about technology that I think is part of this larger scope of discourse with texts from history of science and technology studies, or science and technology studies, kind of, the Latour kind of side of things. Pairing those things together, theory and practice, to try to push the conversation in a more productive direction. And lastly, I've got a bit of a cheeky style guide, which offers some very concrete ways to kind of avoid those tired narratives that we keep telling about technology, whether it's good or bad, or it's all going to hell, or it's progress is the near future. So that's all available. And lastly, I just want to frame this as this larger question. And I think that can be a larger question that we can think of anytime we're talking either about the role of technology as it affects journalism, but also journalism covering technology. And that is to say, what are we optimizing for? I think that is often the core question at hand. And in the case of the Facebook newsfeed conversation, actually former Facebook designer has written, sadly, newsfeed optimizes for engagement. As we've learned in this election, bullshit is highly engaging. So I find that question is often at the core of these debates, and is a really productive way of tearing apart what's at stake here. And often I think that question, or doing the work of exposing what's behind these choices, these optimization choices, and the power behind those choices, leads us to questions about whether that's the right or appropriate thing to be optimizing for. So with that, I leave it to you. Thank you.